Hello and welcome to the channel. My name is Roland and I like dice. That's why today we're making a silicone mold that is an exact copy of our Dice Masters. This will allow us to make different designs with the same shape as the originals. The style of mold I'm making today is called a slab mold or cap mold, known for its signature, well, cap. A slab mold like this is always made in two parts. We'll start with step 1, the base. We're using a two-part mold housing from Cassiopeia Dice. It's a great product and super easy to use, though I don't like the texture of 3D printed lines in my silicone, so I use clear packing tape as a barrier on the inner wall. Also note that while I use a specifically branded product for dice making, there are tons of different things you can use as mold housings. Anything from Tupperware to PVC pipe. If you guys want, I can make a video covering different types of those sorts of products. So we use our clamps on each tab of the mold housing to keep them in place and then use transfer tape to create a sort of base for our dice to sit on. You can use packing tape too if you have it. We'll cut off some of the excess tape, and then I like to flip it over and firmly press all along the edges to make sure I have a firm seal, as we'll soon be pouring liquid silicone inside. Next, we'll grab our Dice Masters. These ones I ordered from my friends at Clerix Components and polished myself. Here I am placing them inside the housing. Ideally, you'll want to leave at least 1/4 of an inch of space between each dice and as much as you can from the walls. Notice how I place them with the one space against the tape. This is because the bottom will become the top, where the lid meets the base, and where flashing and scarring most often show up on your resin copies. Better it on the lowest face than on the highest. Now we'll mix our first batch of silicone. I'm using a 1-to-1 mix, that is our 1 part A and 1 part B of BB Dino 30A. This silicone is nice and thin when it's mixed up, and that just makes it easier to get into all the little nooks and crannies of each number. But you can certainly experiment on what kind of silicone you enjoy most. We'll give this guy a mix, like a long mix, like really your hand should be cramping, and then you mix some more until the colors are perfectly blended. Make sure to scrape the sides and bottom of your cup as you go. Now once it's all mixed, you'll want to pour the silicone high and very slow into the mold. Notice how I only pour on one space, not all over, and I don't pour on a die. The silicone will flow through the mold and get into any small spaces and numbers of the dice for a perfect mold. It also helps to prevent air bubbles and voids from forming as your silicone cures. Give it just a second for any bubbles to rise to the surface, then a quick trip to the pressure pot at 40 psi, and we're ready to move on to the next step. But before we continue, I do need to mention for any of the would-be makers out there, which is probably why you're watching this video, just how important it is that you're wearing proper protective gear. That means gloves and a respirator at a minimum every time you're handling chemicals, as they can be very toxic, especially over long-term exposure. Okay, with that out of the way, it's time to prep the mold for a lid. To do this, we'll first carefully unpeel the transfer tape from the bottom, careful not to pull the silicone around your dice too hard. Then, with an X-Acto knife or scalpel like I use, cleaning up any silicone that may have crept between the dice and your transfer tape. I use a mixture of the scalpel and peeling with my finger to get those tiny strands off. After that, we'll peel the mold housing off, and I like to trim up the edges with a cuticle cutter, just to make it a little bit cleaner. Next, we'll create registration marks on the outside. As you can see, my mold comes with pre-made marks, but sometimes I like to make them a little bit longer, and I want to show you how it gets done. Those registration marks help to align the lid and the mold. Normally, if you were to just pour more silicone on top of this without any sort of barrier, the two sides would stick together permanently and your dice would then be trapped in a silicone jail. So we need something to create a barrier between those two sides. I use talc powder, though Vaseline is another popular choice. With this talc, I brush it on the cap and over the dice, making sure that everything is covered. It's important to get complete coverage, including your newly made registration marks, and just shake that excess off after you're done. Keep in mind that talc is not good for you, so wear your gloves, wear your respirator, and be smart. So we'll put the mold housing on again, this time upside down so the keys are facing toward the top. And do the same process of mixing up our silicone in a 1-to-1 ratio and pouring very slowly. Then it's just another 8 hours in the pot.
8 hours later.
And here it is. All that's left is to separate the two halves, which can definitely be a process. So just go slow, work around and around and around, and eventually it will pop off. To get those dice masters out, just flex the sides to loosen up the numbers and squeeze from the bottom. They are packed into the silicone, literally airtight, so it's okay if it takes some gentle force. You just want to be aware and avoid tearing out those numbers. Optionally, you can do some trimming to make it look a bit cleaner. I like to flex my new molds a little bit and take off the lid about a dozen times to make sure it fits well and starts to develop a sort of muscle memory. We've now made a complete silicone mold for the dice. This BB Dino silicone makes molds that last for a really long time without tearing, so I'll have plenty of upcoming designs to show off before I need to make a new mold. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video and seeing my process, please consider the usual things: a like, a comment, or a subscribe to see more content related to tabletops and particularly dice in the future. But for now, that's all.